Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Wagh, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Contemporary Women's Movement, Campaigns, Issues and Organizations. In this module, we will look into how the whole idea of contemporary women's movement grew out of the challenges that has come, especially in terms of its campaigns, growth and the kind of issues of organizations. Further, we will look into how until the 1990s, what were the kinds of campaigns, issues and organizations that were raised by the women's movement in India. Further, we will also look into the pre-independence women's movement and also focus on the political and economic context of the 90s, 80s and the 1970s. Further, at the end, we will focus on the various campaigns raised by the women's movement in India, especially the campaign on violence against women. The module follows a timeline format to chart the progress of the women's movement. It has two main sections, the 70s and the 80s, followed by a summarizing conclusion. Each of the two main sections are interspersed with campaigns, organizations and issues central to the movement. Section 1, the 70s. The period of calm did not last too long. 15 years on, beset by myriad problems, the new democratic government refused to tackle. People began to organize politically, with women occupying central roles in these struggles. The 60s and the early 70s were peppered with radical social movements, student uprisings, workers and peasant protests, and also tribal and anti-caste movement. These movements covered a vast range from the Gandhian socialist non-violent protests to the far-left Maoist insurgencies. Many of the first women's movements in the post-independence India were initiated by the Gandhian socialists, anti-alcohol agitations in North India and anti-corruption agitations among others. The new women's groups that emerged after the lull clearly understood women's issues and analyzed them differently from those before them. Their emphasis was no longer on charity and social work, a common characteristic in women's group in the post-independence era. According to Agnihotri and Veena Majumdar in their articles titled Changing Terms of Political Discourse, Women's Movement in India, 1970s to 1990s, resurgence of women's movement in the contemporary India has been impacted by 1. The crisis of the state and government in the 70s going into emergency, post-emergency upsurge in favor of civil rights, 3. Mushrooming of women's organization in the early 1980s and the arrival of women's issues on the agenda, 4. The mid-1980s marked by a fundamentalist advance and the 1990s when the crisis deepened with regard to state, government and society. The women's movement in India only gained real traction post-1970. Protests in Maharashtra at this time as well as anti-price rise and anti-alcohol activism contributed to this development. Two women's groups that emerged at this time took upon themselves to study the causes of women's oppression. Both grew out of the Maoist far left, the Progressive Organization of the Women and the League of Women Soldiers for Equality. Women's movement was beginning to question the state on issues from land rights to legal issues concerning rape, dowry and personal law. The movements were also questioning the government's path of development, accusing it of being gender blind. Even though these protests and agitations could not boast of women leaders as they were organized mainly by the males and political parties, women became aware of the collectively held strength. Radha Kumar argues that the most significant movement at this time were the Shahada and the anti-price rise movement in Maharashtra and Seva and Nav Nirman in Gujarat. The anti-price rise agitation that was started in 1973 by two socialist and a communist party coming together to mobilize city women. The Nav Nirman movement in Gujarat, started by the students to protest rapidly rising prices, was also joined by middle-class women in large numbers in 1974. This movement was not specifically anti-patriarchal. On the contrary, it saw domestic expenditure and by extension the family and the household at women's sphere. In Hyderabad, the women students who were part of the organization called Progressive Organization of Women started campaigning against dowry and sexual harassment. The fact that the women joined public protest in large numbers itself was a threat to patriarchy, and Radha Kumar believes that it laid the foundation of anti-patriarchal sentiments that would follow in the feminist movement in the late 1970s. In the mid-1970s, the UN declared 1975 as the International Women's Year and the 1975 and 1980 to 1985 as the International Decade for Women. It has given a mandate to governments of member countries that required them to conduct research into the status of women so that they could critically assess it. A special committee called the Committee on the Status of Women in India (CSWI) was appointed for this purpose, and it included activists, academics and members of parliament. Towards equality, the report of the Committee on the Status of Women in India was completed in 1974, just before the national emergency, and is considered the foundation of women's movement in India, as it reinvented the discussion regarding the women's question and what it meant to the policy makers and the state as well as activists and the researchers. The report brought to the fore issues like gender inequality made obvious through imbalance in sex ratios, mortality rates and the trials faced by women on a social and cultural level like dowry, child marriage, etc. It flagged legal practices that were discriminatory, economic practices that failed to give women's contribution its due, as well as disadvantages to girls and women in the education system and the political system. The report acted as an eye-opener and spurred many groups to take action. It effectively unearthed and put on display the disastrous ground realities for women in India. The reality was in fact a far cry from the constitutional mandate. This report led to the parliamentary debates in which it came to be recognized that women were not only beneficiaries of policy but could also contribute critically to the policy making process as policy makers. The press, through their coverage of dowry deaths and rapes like the Mathura rape case, created awareness among civil society to these issues. In fact, as far as generation and dissemination of information is concerned, women's movement and media played a significant role, working in tandem. As far as the state is concerned, the 70s was a time of deepening crises within the society and the state, more so when the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared emergency in 1975. Democratic rights and civil liberties were trampled upon by the government, which led to a citizens' movements all over the country to reassert democracy. The women's movement was one of the many that asserted the participative role that citizens must be allowed to play in the political and development process in the country. Therefore, while the emergency led to a forced lull in the protest and agitation, theoretical discussions continued, and by the time the emergency was lifted in 1977, several women's organizations had already begun taking shape. Most of these groups were based in larger cities like Bombay, Delhi, Aurangabad, Madras among them. After 1975, women's movement saw the need to organize themselves effectively and also began taking its cue from mass interest in popular politics. The mid-70s saw many middle-class educated women attempting to analyze women's oppression as well as resorting to radical politics. Many political parties started women's wing. Congress had the Mahila Congress, Janata Party had Mahila Dakshata Samiti, which led protests on various issues concerning women. Gail Omvedt called these pre-movements because while they show the power that women have in society and eventually led to the development of women's movement, they raise issues of caste and class as a whole rather than only women's issues. By acting as a starting point, that is bringing women into the mass movements in great numbers, the 70s were a watershed in the history of women's movement. Section 2. The 8. The careful analysis of women's issues and oppression and the steps taken to improve their condition crystallized into the autonomous women's movement. By the 1980s, women's organizations were not only developing but also creating facilities and alliances and defining their identity, purpose and strategies. However, emphasizing that all women suffered a common oppression wasn't enough, because in reality intersecting systems of class, ethnicity, caste, power, relations created differences. It was for this reason that the women's movement was seen as a middle-class phenomenon. To compound these interests and these issues, by the mid-1980s, even though the rights of the women were being attacked using tradition and culture to emphasize that the woman's natural historical role lay in reproduction. The autonomous women's group were different from the older women's organizations in that they were analyzing the root of women's oppression and fighting for the rights of the women and for the issues they considered important from the perspective, and by employing militant means. Autonomous in this context does not mean the women's question was depoliticized, but that the groups do not have affiliations with any political parties, government or any political connections. The members were far from apolitical, and the leaders tended to be young, dedicated to the cause, educated middle class who moved out of mass organizations. While the mass-based movements focused on the problems of the poor and highlighted issues like caste and communalism, they failed to recognize the oppression of the women and the fact that they were perpetuating patriarchal norms in both the political and personal sphere. One of the most important issues that the women's movement began to address in the late 70s and 80s and continues to address today is that of violence against women in the family, community, society and within the state. This was done through campaigns against rape, dowry and social evils like amniocentesis, sex selection, as well as more general issues like population control and political violence. Women's movement in general has taken the resource to the law and when required in order to effect social change. Women's organization in the 80s took action not only to demand legislative change but also challenge existing archaic and inequitable laws. The Mathura rape and its aftermath, the acquittal of the policeman rapist, led to the agitation across the country to reopen the case in the Supreme Court as well as to review the pro-rapist rape laws that existed at this time. This case became the spark which caused women's group in the 80s to organize against sexual oppression, especially of women from the lower classes who were prone to custodial rape, sexual harassment and gang rape. In Mumbai, the organization Forum Against Rape was started, who protested publicly and asked for legal action to be taken. The work bore fruit and rape laws were modified thanks to the anti-rape campaigns of the late 70s and the early 80s. In 1983, criminal law amendment was passed in which revealing rape women's victims' identity was made an offence and made custodial rape a new category of offence that takes place the burden of proof on the rape accused. The anti-dowry campaigns taken up by the media in the 1980s also helped to spread awareness about the social problem. Organizations like the Dahej Virodhi Chetana Manch in Delhi, composed of women's rights organizations and other civil rights groups campaigned through the street theatre, posters and demonstrations to focus on one of the most extreme forms of domestic violence manifested in dowry deaths. The violence that women experience in the private sphere of home is often the most difficult to reach and prevent. Joint Select Committee of the Parliament appointed in 1981 looked into this issue. The Law Commission was also conducting an inquiry at the same time into this issue and submitted a report of its recommendation in 1983 to make changes to both the substantive law as well as the Evidence Act in connection with the dowry deaths. Acts of violence against women like rape of Mathura, Ramiza Bai as well as incidents of rape in the case of Room Cover acted as a rallying point for women's group and starting point for ordinary women to join the women's movement. Some of the women who were part of the leftist movement in the late 70s and early 80s felt alienated and began to separate and start autonomous feminist groups which took up the causes of other social movements regarding poverty, class, caste issues at that time. PAO in Hyderabad was replaced by the Sri Shakti Sangatna, which in turn influenced the Purogami Sangatna's formation in Pune. Sri Sangharsh and Mahila Dakshata in Delhi and Vimochana in Bangalore are among the other prominent organizations started at this time. Magazines and journals are also developing and spreading the message of women's equality in English as well as regional languages. The Feminist Network in English from Bombay, Ahila and Pratibha Di Chetana in Bengali from Kolkata, Baiza in Marathi from Pune are only few. The well-known feminist journal Manushi was started in Delhi by a group of women in 1977. The 80s saw an increase in the feminist literature because feminist literary critics felt that women needed a literature to call their own, a space in which they could fully express their experiences and consider their feminine issues. This writing expressed feelings of anger, oppression, exploitation and hatred. A feminist consciousness was emerging through the participation of women in various mass movements. Attempts were also made in the 1980s to organize workers' unions for women workers. In Bombay in particular, they were against the retrenchment of women mine workers and textile workers. At a time when work was hard to come by and unemployment was rife, these attempts were not quite as successful as was expected. Women stood in support of the men, demanding at least one wage per family, even if that wage was earned by male. Feminists attempting to organize these workers realized that women were far more likely to be militant if the cause was one that affected the family rather than that those specifically affected them as women. Some of the women's organizations also emerged from the women's participation in border peasant struggles, during which they began and recognized their own oppression. However, as we have seen in the case of women workers, their development was far from smooth. While women were a central part of the militant struggles, they did not manage to change the patriarchal basis of these organizations. For example, the Chhattisgarh Mine Workers Shramik Sangh are also a good example of this, as their women were more likely to organize successfully when union was mindful of issues like housing and schooling and health services for the workers' family. City-based feminists doing the job of organizing in these cases was learning valuable lessons. They were moving into unfamiliar territory and coordinating activities, sometimes with the groups that had never been exposed to feminist idea or activities. An important question arises here. Will issue-based agitations ever help to create a broad-based women's movement? Do we rely too much on legislative measures and militant activism that are only short-term solutions rather than destroying larger structures of oppression? Will people eventually lose out their enthusiasm in the movement? In this regard, Kishwar argues that selecting women's issues only narrows down the scope of politics. Instead, she argues as organizing women but joining hands with other groups as well as others, because women are almost always least half of all oppressed groups. We must be present in the movements in general while we struggle for our own rights. The 80s was also a time when the state began to use the language of women's movement, saying that women's groups need to organize themselves and women need to fight for their own rights. In the beginning of 1987, the Government of India set up a commission, the National Commission on Self-Employed Women and Women in the Informal Sector, on which the Magsaysay Award winner Ila Bhatt was also a member of the Rajya Sabha at that time at the helm. The Shram Shakti report submitted by the 5-member commission describes the self-employed and unorganized women workers they were meant to study in great depth. It details the resilience of these women amidst government insensitivity and lack of infrastructure. The report was vast in its scope and proved to be of good use to both bureaucrats, planners, women activists alike. Women working as fisher folk, rag pickers, in tea gardens as construction workers, or those selling small goods on the pavements have always been marginalized, shunted aside by the development process. Women in the informal sector often take up male activities like transplanting, harvesting, threshing, and stone breaking, yet the census recognizes them as housewives and nothing more. 60% of women, according to the Commission's finding, were only breadwinners for the family but survived only on half man's wage. Ila Bhatt, chairperson of the report, says in the preface, "I learned that these women are better fighters against poverty than their men, have more calculative, stable, forward-looking strategies to deal with their own environment, yet the women remain poorer." Failure to implement the already existing laws only worsens the situation. The Shram Shakti report therefore includes recommendations made by the committee to, among other things, to maintain and promote grassroots level organizations in order to improve the circumstances of women in informal employment in India. The National Perspective Plan was also formulated in 1988 for the betterment of women with the cooperation of the state, which made plans to improve the lives of women in the spheres of education, health, and participation in politics. Another challenge faced by the women was that of fragmentation within autonomous groups, a divide between activist and non-activist urban-based groups with a focus on issues like domestic violence and understanding operation and grassroots programs among the poor in both urban and rural areas, hoping for the survival in which gender issues form a part. Landlessness, poverty, bondage are not only class issues but also gender issues, because in these cases women suffer the double oppression men do. To compound the problem of class and culture between activists and non-activists, there is also a problem of communication. There exists a lack of communication between the English upper middle class, English-speaking women, and the majority of which happens to be the poor and the Hindi-speaking. This barrier extends from language, dress, and lifestyle to perceptions, perspectives, and the kind of politics they implied for the struggle and what its focus will be. Women's studies and women's movement have also had an important association. Women's studies expose women to scholarship and widen the scope of the struggle. In attempt at understanding women's issues using economics, politics, and understanding of knowledge and power, better equipped women by transforming their consciousness and giving them a sense of identity and purpose. Women's studies are not value neutral as other social sciences are. It's knowledge as intervention in order to bring about social change by making gender disparities clear and tracing the roots of the oppression of women. The Third National Conference of Women's Studies in 1986 addressed the burning issues of the time: religion, secularism, and women's rights. There was a need to appreciate the close relationship that religion and patriarchy had. As mentioned in the earlier, the 80s were a time when women's traditional roles were emphasized. Revivalist forces were gaining power and secularism was under fire. Women turned out to be the biggest losers when religion, which was gaining importance at such a time, began to take precedence over their rights, resulting in further inequality. Fundamentalism in the 80s was in some ways caused the fight for women's equality to regress. An often cited case of Muslim woman, Shah Bano, is a perfect example to illustrate the relationship between communalism, fundamentalism, and women's rights. In this module, I won't go into the detail because in many of the modules you will find a detailed examination of the Shah Bano case. The women's movement that had now begun to recognize differences between women based on caste, class, religion, culture was now also forced to recognize religious distinction. The category of Indian women now included the important constituent of communal identity.
Any attempts made to better the condition of women within a religious community was labeled as an interference as going against the principle of secularism.
In conclusion, students, in the module regarding campaigns, issues and organizations of women's movement, we have raised the importance of mass movements, especially in raising rights-based issues for women. Further, the question of human rights became very important, especially in the context of emergency being declared in the country. Further, we also have focused on how the 1970s to 1980s have saw the rise of autonomous women's movement in India. Further, we have also looked into how the whole issue of women's question came to foreground, especially within the context of theorization of patriarchy, which led to our questioning of archaic laws, especially relating to violence against women. Further, we have also focused on how in the 70s and later on in the 80s, the emergence of women's studies have led to an understanding that women's studies is an intellectual arm of women's movement in India. Thank you.